In 1975, a woman in the Midwestern United States sold her house. She wasn't in financial trouble. She wasn't moving for a job. She sold it because her church told her the end of the world was coming, and she believed them. She took the money, gave most of it to the organization, and spent her remaining days knocking on doors, warning strangers that Armageddon was just months away. She wasn't alone. Across the world, thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses did the same thing that year. They sold homes. They emptied savings accounts. They pulled children out of school. They quit careers they had spent decades building. Some refused medical treatment, believing that God's paradise would heal what doctors could not. And then 1975 came and went. No Armageddon, no paradise, no divine intervention. Just an ordinary year, followed by an extraordinary silence from the people who had made the promise. But here's the part that most people never learn. 1975 was not an isolated mistake. It was not a one-time miscalculation by well-meaning religious leaders who simply got carried away. It was the fourth time this organization had predicted the end of the world. The fourth time they had told their followers to prepare for something that never came. And it wouldn't be the last. Over the span of more than a century, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, the organization behind Jehovah's Witnesses, has set 5 specific expectations for the end of the world. 1874, 1914, 1925, 1975, and a generational promise that quietly expired and was rewritten while millions were still waiting. 5 predictions, 5 failures, and after each one, the same remarkable pattern: no admission of error, no accountability, no apology. Instead, the meaning of the prediction was quietly changed. The words were redefined, the timeline was adjusted, and the followers were told, once again, to keep waiting. What you're about to hear is not speculation. Every claim in this video comes from the organization's own publications, their own books, their own magazines, their own convention talks. This is their record, in their own words. And the question it raises is one that every Jehovah's Witness deserves to consider. How many times does a prophecy have to fail before you're allowed to question the people making it? Let's start at the beginning. Part 1. 1874. The Invisible Return. In the 1870s, a young man from Allegheny, Pennsylvania, named Charles Taze Russell, found himself consumed by a single question. When would Jesus Christ return to earth? Russell had grown up Presbyterian, drifted away from organized religion as a teenager, and then been pulled back in by the Adventist movement, a loose network of Christians who believed the Bible contained hidden chronological clues pointing to the exact timing of Christ's second coming. Russell fell under the influence of Nelson Barber, an Adventist preacher and writer who had spent years calculating prophetic timelines from the book of Daniel. Barber had concluded that Christ would return in 1874. He published this prediction widely, and when the year arrived, he and his followers waited. Nothing happened. No visible return, no heavenly event, no transformation of the world. 1874 passed like any other year. But Barber didn't do what you might expect. He didn't say, "I was wrong." He didn't go back to the drawing board. Instead, he did something far more consequential, something that would become the blueprint for every failed prophecy that followed. He changed the nature of the prediction. Christ had returned, Barber declared. But the return was invisible. It was a spiritual presence, not a physical one. Jesus was now present in a heavenly sense, and the fact that no one could see or detect this presence was not a problem. It was part of the plan. Russell embraced this explanation completely. He adopted it, expanded on it, and made it the cornerstone of his emerging Bible student movement. In his writings, Russell taught that Christ's invisible presence had begun in 1874, and that this marked the start of a prophetic countdown toward the final end. He published this teaching in a series of books called Studies in the Scriptures, which eventually reached millions of readers in multiple languages. Think carefully about what was being asked of these early followers. The most significant event in Christian theology, the return of the Son of God, had supposedly taken place, and the only evidence for it was a mathematical calculation and the word of a man in Pennsylvania. No one had witnessed anything. No one had experienced anything. The entire claim rested on trust. Trust in the leader and trust in his arithmetic. And yet people believed. Not a handful of people, thousands. The Bible student movement grew rapidly through the 1880s and 1890s, attracting followers across the United States and into Europe. Russell became a prolific publisher and public speaker, drawing crowds of people hungry for certainty about the future. And the foundation of that certainty was a prediction that had already failed and been repackaged as something it was never meant to be. This matters because it establishes the template for everything that follows. A specific, bold prediction is made. When reality doesn't cooperate, the prediction isn't abandoned, it's reinterpreted. The words stay the same, but their meaning is quietly changed. And the followers, having already invested their trust, accept the new version and move forward. It's a cycle. And in 1914, it was about to repeat on a much larger scale. Part 2, 1914. The end that became a beginning. By the early 1900s, Charles Taze Russell had moved on from 1874 and fixed his gaze on a far more ambitious date, 1914. This was not going to be another invisible event. This was going to be visible, dramatic, and unmistakable. Russell taught that 1914 would mark the complete end of the current world system. Human governments would be swept away. God's kingdom would take full and direct control of the earth. The faithful would be vindicated, rewarded, and ushered into a new era. And everyone who had rejected the message would face divine judgment. This was published everywhere. It appeared in Russell's books, in Watchtower magazines, in pamphlets distributed on street corners and through the mail. His followers organized public lectures in rented halls across the country, announcing to anyone who would listen that 1914 was the deadline. The message was clear, specific, and stated with total confidence: the world as we know it will end in 1914. The prophetic calculation behind this claim was based on a concept called the Gentile times, a period Russell and his followers believed was outlined in the book of Daniel. According to their interpretation, this period began with the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of Solomon's temple, which they dated to 607 BCE. From that starting point, they counted forward 2,120 years, a number derived from their reading of prophetic times, and arrived at 1914. There's a problem with this, and it's not a small one. Mainstream historians, archaeologists, and scholars of the ancient Near East place the fall of Jerusalem not in 607 BCE, but in 587 BCE. This isn't a matter of debate in the academic world. It's supported by Babylonian chronicles, astronomical records, and multiple independent lines of evidence. A 20-year error in the starting date collapses the entire calculation. But Russell's followers were not encouraged to examine the math. They were encouraged to believe it. So the world waited, or at least Russell's followers did. And then 1914 arrived. The world did not end. There was no divine intervention. No kingdom of God descended from heaven to replace human civilization. But something enormous did happen in 1914. World War I erupted across Europe. And this coincidence, because that's what it was, a coincidence, gave the Watchtower leadership exactly the material they needed to rewrite the narrative. Almost immediately, the prediction was reinterpreted. 1914 was no longer the date of the end. It was the date of the beginning of the end. Christ had not destroyed the current system. He had begun ruling invisibly in heaven. The war, the suffering, the upheaval, all of it was reframed as evidence that Satan had been cast down to earth and that the last days had begun. Picture this for a moment. You're told your wedding is on October 15th. You show up at the church. Your family is there. Everything is ready. And then the officiant stands up and says, "There's been a slight change. Today isn't actually the wedding. Today is the spiritual engagement. The wedding is still coming. We just don't know when." Would you accept that? Would your family accept that? Millions of Jehovah's Witnesses did. And they didn't just accept it passively. They built their entire theological identity around the reinterpretation. To this day, 1914 remains the most important date in Jehovah's Witness theology. The organization still teaches that Christ began ruling in heaven in 1914, even though the original prediction said nothing about an invisible heavenly rule. It was about the visible, total end of the world. That's what was promised. That's not what happened. And yet the authority of the organization survived. The followers regrouped. The publications kept printing. And the leadership turned its attention to a brand new date, one that would produce the most bizarre episode in the entire history of this movement. Part 3. 1925. The House That Prophecy Built. Charles Taze Russell died in 1916, and leadership of the organization passed to Joseph Franklin Rutherford. Where Russell had been a studious, somewhat reserved publisher, Rutherford was bold, authoritarian, and absolutely certain of himself. He wasted no time putting his own prophetic stamp on the movement, and the date he chose was 1925. In 1920, Rutherford published a booklet titled, "Millions Now Living Will Never Die." The title itself was a prophecy, a promise that the current generation of believers would live to see the end of the world and never experience death. But the specific claim inside the booklet went even further than that. Rutherford declared that in 1925, the ancient patriarchs of the Hebrew Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and other faithful men, would be physically resurrected and returned to earth. Not symbolically, not spiritually, physically. These men, who had been dead for thousands of years, would walk among the living again. Rutherford taught that they would serve as earthly representatives of God's kingdom, helping to govern the new world that was about to begin. This was promoted aggressively. Rutherford delivered lectures to audiences of thousands, telling them with absolute confidence that 1925 would bring the resurrection of the patriarchs. The Watchtower magazine reinforced the message. Membership surged as people were drawn in by the specificity and boldness of the claim. This wasn't vague end times language. This was a date, a name, and a specific event. Abraham was coming back. In 1925, for certain. And then Rutherford did something that remains, to this day, one of the most astonishing acts in the history of modern religion. In 1929, the Watchtower Society purchased property in San Diego, California, and built an elegant 10-room mansion. They named it Beth Sarim, Hebrew for House of the Princes. And the official stated, published purpose of this house was to serve as a residence for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob upon their return. Stop and consider what this means. This was not a fringe group meeting in someone's basement. This was the central organization of a growing worldwide religious movement. They used donated funds, money contributed by ordinary members, to build a physical home for men who had been dead for roughly 4,000 years. They put the property deed in the names of the ancient patriarchs. They furnished it and maintained it, waiting for its intended occupants to arrive. Of course, no one arrived. 1925 passed without a resurrection. Abraham did not knock on the door of Beth Sarim, and the members who had rearranged their expectations, their finances, and their lives around this promise were left with nothing but silence. Rutherford, to his limited credit, did acknowledge the failure, briefly. In a 1925 Watchtower article, he reportedly admitted that he had made an ass of himself regarding the prediction. But this admission was never turned into a formal apology. It was never presented to the membership as a reason to question the organization's prophetic authority. And Beth Sarim? It quietly became Rutherford's personal winter residence, where he lived until his death in 1942. The house was eventually sold, and the entire episode was pushed deep into the footnotes of official Watchtower history. Rarely mentioned, never explained. Members who lost faith after 1925 left, but the majority stayed. And the reason they stayed reveals something important about how this cycle works. After each failure, there's a brief window of doubt, followed by a renewed assurance that the next prediction, the next understanding, the next adjustment will be the right one. The organization doesn't lose authority by being wrong. It maintains authority by always having a next answer ready. And the next answer, the one that would come 50 years later, would cause more damage than all the previous ones combined. Part 4. 1975. The year that cost everything. Everything before 1975, the invisible return, the reinterpreted war, the empty mansion, was theology. It was strange, it was wrong, but it was largely abstract. 1975 was different. 1975 was personal. And for thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses around the world, 1975 was devastating. The buildup began in the mid-1960s. In 1966, the Watchtower Society published a book titled Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God. Inside was a chronological chart that traced human history from the creation of Adam to the present, and it concluded that 6,000 years of human existence would end in the autumn of 1975. The implication was unmistakable. The end of 6,000 years of human history would align with the beginning of God's great Sabbath rest, the 1,000-year reign of Christ. In other words, Armageddon was coming in 1975. The organization was careful, in print, to avoid saying this in absolute terms. There were occasional qualifiers, words like possibly, and it remains to be seen. But the tone of the publications, the language of convention talks, and the behavior of the leadership told a very different story. At a 1966 convention, the release of the book was met with enormous excitement. Audience members reportedly gasped and applauded when the 1975 date was presented. District overseers and circuit overseers repeated the message in congregations around the world. And the message that reached ordinary members wasn't cautious or qualified. It was urgent. A 1969 Awake magazine article addressed young Jehovah's Witnesses directly, telling them that the current system of things would not last long enough for them to grow old in it. It discouraged higher education and long-term career planning, because the end was so near that such pursuits were pointless. Think about what that means. Teenagers were being told, in print, by their own religious organization, not to plan for the future, because there wouldn't be one. And people responded exactly the way you would expect when you truly believe the world is about to end. Families sold homes at a loss because they didn't need them anymore. Workers quit stable jobs to devote their final months to full-time preaching. Parents pulled children out of school, reasoning that education was meaningless in a world that was about to be destroyed. Some elderly members refused medical treatment, believing that God's new world would arrive before the disease could take them. People cashed in retirement savings, canceled insurance policies, and gave their money to the organization. The level of sacrifice was staggering, and it wasn't happening in isolation. It was happening because the most trusted authority in these people's lives had created an atmosphere of absolute certainty about what was coming. Then 1975 arrived. Autumn came and went. Nothing happened. No Armageddon, no paradise, no divine destruction of the wicked. The world continued exactly as it had before. And what did the Watchtower leadership do? They blamed the members. In the years following 1975, official publications began suggesting that certain brothers and sisters had read too much into the date. Members had let their enthusiasm run ahead of what the organization had actually said, they claimed. It was a personal failing, a lack of spiritual maturity, not an organizational error. This is a crucial point, so let it sink in. The organization created the expectation. They published the timeline. They delivered the convention talks. They printed the articles discouraging education and career planning. They created the atmosphere of urgency that drove people to sell their homes and abandon their futures. And when the date failed, they pointed the finger at the very people who had trusted them most. The fallout was immense. In the years following 1975, the Watchtower Society experienced its largest membership decline in modern history. Tens of thousands left. Some were disillusioned. Some were angry. Some were simply broken. Financially, emotionally, and spiritually. They had given everything based on a promise, and they had received nothing in return except blame. But here is perhaps the most painful part. Many stayed, not because they still believed the prophecy, but because they had nowhere else to go. They had severed relationships with non-witness family members. They had left behind careers they couldn't return to. They had built their entire social world inside the organization, and leaving meant losing everything. Again. And so the cycle continued. But this time, the leadership learned a lesson, not about the danger of making predictions, but about the danger of naming specific years. Part 5. The generation that would not pass away. After the catastrophe of 1975, the Watchtower organization stopped naming specific dates, but they did not stop making time-based prophetic promises. They simply found a more flexible way to do it. The vehicle they chose was a single Bible verse, Matthew 24:34. In this passage, Jesus is quoted as saying, "Truly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen." The Watchtower applied this verse to the generation alive in 1914, the year they still claimed marked the beginning of Christ's invisible rule. Their teaching was straightforward. People who were alive in 1914 and old enough to understand the significance of the events of that year would not all die before Armageddon arrived. The end would come within that generation's lifetime. This was not a footnote in some obscure publication. It was the centerpiece of Watchtower eschatology for decades, for years. The Awake magazine carried a statement on its masthead, declaring that the magazine existed to give comfort, that it pointed to the Creator's promise of a peaceful new world before the generation that saw the events of 1914 passes away. Every issue, every printing, millions of copies, in dozens of languages, carrying this promise into homes around the world. And for a while, it worked. Unlike the specific dates of the past, the generational promise felt both urgent and elastic. There was no single day that could prove it wrong. As long as someone from 1914 was still alive, the clock was still ticking. It kept members in a state of permanent expectation without the risk of a single dramatic failure. But biology is unforgiving. By the 1980s, the people who had been old enough to witness the events of 1914 were in their 70s and 80s. By the 1990s, they were in their 90s. The generation was dying, and with every funeral, the promise became harder to defend. So in 1995, the Watchtower did what it had done so many times before. It changed the definition. The word generation in Matthew 24:34 no longer referred specifically to people alive in 1914, the organization announced. It was now understood in a broader, more general sense, referring to the type of people living in the last days, not a specific chronological group. This was a massive shift, and it happened with remarkably little fanfare. A teaching that had defined the urgency of the witness message for decades was quietly retired and replaced with something far less specific. Many longtime members noticed. Many were troubled. Some left. But the organization moved on. And then, in 2010, the definition changed yet again. The Watchtower introduced what they called the overlapping generations concept. Under this new understanding, the generation of 1914 didn't end when the last person alive in 1914 died. Instead, it could extend to include a second group, people whose lives overlapped with the first group. In other words, someone born in, say, 1990 could be part of the 1914 generation if they lived at the same time as someone who had been alive in 1914. Read that one more time and let it settle. A generation, a word with a clear, commonly understood meaning, was redefined to include people who were not born until decades after the event in question. The original promise was that people alive in 1914 would see the end. When they died without seeing it, the definition of generation was stretched to cover people who never saw 1914 at all. They didn't admit the prophecy failed. They didn't apologize. They didn't take responsibility. They changed what the word meant and asked 8 million people to accept the new definition and keep waiting. 5 predictions, 5 failures, and every single time, the same response. Never accountability. Never an honest acknowledgement that they were wrong. Instead, a quiet redefinition, a careful shift in language, a new explanation that preserves the authority of the organization at the expense of the people who trusted it. In 1874, they said Christ had returned, but invisibly, in a way no one could verify. In 1914, they said the world would end, and when it didn't, they called it the beginning of the end. In 1925, they said dead men would walk the earth, and built a mansion to welcome them. In 1975, they created an atmosphere of total urgency, and when nothing happened, they blamed the very people who had sacrificed the most. And in the generation teaching, they took a word with a clear meaning and stretched it beyond recognition, because admitting the truth would mean admitting that every timeline they ever published was wrong. The pattern is there for anyone willing to see it. Predict, fail, redefine, repeat. And at every stage, the cost is borne not by the leaders who made the promise, but by the ordinary members who believed it. The families who sold everything. The young people who were told not to pursue education. The elderly who spent their entire lives waiting for something that was always just around the corner, until the corner was moved. Prophecy without accountability is not prophecy, it is control. It is a system that demands total trust while offering no responsibility in return. And the question that every Jehovah's Witness alive today deserves to sit with, quietly, honestly, without fear, is this: how many times does a prediction have to fail before you're allowed to question the people making it? If you lived through any of these dates, if you were there in 1975, if you remember the generational promise, if you watched someone you love give up their future because of a prediction that never came true, I want to hear from you. Your experience is not a footnote. It's not an embarrassment. It is the most important part of this entire story, because without your voice, the organization gets to keep rewriting what happened. Leave your story in the comments. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now, because we're just getting started.